Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute of America. I'm Kyle Ferrier, the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. I'm also serving as the moderator for today's event. Today's event is also part of our academic paper series, through which KEI commissions a series of papers and invites the authors to come to Washington, D.C. for a public panel such as the one we have here today to present their research and their findings. Today's program will focus on U.S. policy towards North Korea under the incoming Trump administration, which looks to be one of the most significant and challenging security and foreign policy issues he will face. Our speaker, David Straub, is well positioned to not only analyze the complexities of the North Korea problem, but to offer recommendations to best meet U.S. interests as well. David is a former senior foreign service officer and expert on U.S. Korea issues. He served as the head of the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Seoul from 1999 to 2002. The State Department, and he was also served as the head political section, the State Department's Korea desk director from 2002 to 2004, and the State Department's Japan desk director from 2004 to 2006. David has extensive experience working on North Korea, including participating in the first round of the six-party talks and the New York Channel Dialogue. He also accompanied former President Bill Clinton to Pyongyang in 2009 to secure the release of two American journalists. After leaving the State Department, David joined Stanford University, most recently serving as the Associate Director of the Korean Program at the university's Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center from 2008 to 2016. He's also author of the book Anti-Americanism in Democratizing South Korea, which was published in 2015. I actually recognize a few faces from the book launch that you had at Brookings in the audience today, back in November of last year. So I know there's general interest in your book, and I'm sure everyone would be interested to know that the Korean version will actually be coming out within the next month or so. So please join me in welcoming David Straub. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kyle, for the introduction, and my thanks to all of the leaders and staff members of KEI for making this event possible, and especially to Kyle and Troy Stangerone. I've worked with KEI since shortly after it was founded in 1982 with all of the directors and staff. It's always been an important institution here in Washington for bettering U.S.-Korean relations, and I think it's going to probably play an even more important role, will need to and will play an even more important role in the coming weeks and months. I'd like to thank also all of you for coming. I'm especially grateful to former colleagues and current U.S. officials and old friends who've come today. And in terms of former colleagues, especially Al O'Neill, who very generously looked at several drafts of my paper and offered really helpful critique of it. I'm grateful to you all for coming, because I'm acutely aware that offering advice on how to deal with North Korea to the Trump administration is, shall we say, not unprecedented. I know that there are lots of Korea events, some going on even as we speak in town. So thank you. Many organizations and individuals have already offered their thoughts on North Korea policy for the next administration, and many more are scheduled to do so in the coming weeks. By the way, can you all hear me well? Let me know vigorously if at some point I become inaudible or incoherent or whatever. So I want to make this event as useful for you as I can, as worthwhile for you. So I propose to do the following. First, I'm not going to go through the entire paper. I guess you all have that available or will. I'll just characterize the paper, and then I'll summarize some of the main points and mention some of the more possibly provocative assertions. Second, I'm going to try to provide you a little value added beyond what's in the paper. So I'll offer a few additional thoughts and arguments that are not in the paper. And finally, I don't know how long my remarks will take, but I think and hope it will be only about 30 minutes. I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. I certainly don't claim to begin to have a complete understanding of a problem as complex as North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. Many of you in this room are experts on various facets of the problem. So I look forward to your correcting and adding to my own analysis and conclusion and recommendations. So first, let me characterize the paper. I tried to take a little bit of a different approach from some of the other similar efforts that you've seen. So the paper is not comprehensive, and that's not just because in 7,500 words you can't be comprehensive about the Korea problem. I don't address such critically important issues as the military situation and how the U.S. and South Korea should adapt its military policy to provide for deterrence and defense. And because others have written on that, and it's not my area of expertise. So what I focused on was the big picture strategic situation and on statesmanship, diplomacy, if you will, but diplomacy writ large, not simply talks and negotiations. And in the paper, I address what I think are several fundamental issues, and I do so in a way I hope that is at least a little bit different than what you may have heard. Having worked on Korea for most of my adult life in government and more recently in academia, I'm struck by how little Americans, even U.S. leaders, know about the history of American involvement on the Korean Peninsula and our interest there. I'm also troubled that while South Koreans do know a lot about the United States and U.S.-Korean relations, I think most don't really understand what Americans think and feel and intend in regard to the Korean Peninsula. So I thought it was important to begin my paper with a review of American involvement and American interest on the Korean Peninsula, including a discussion of what American priorities, policy priorities, have actually been in practice, which have not always been identical with declared policy. I then look at the problem we face with North Korea now and in the coming years, but focused on the regime's strategic aims. It's critically important that we better understand what North Korean leadership intentions are, and especially how nuclear weapons fit into that. If U.S. leaders don't operate on the basis of a shared theory about North Korean leadership intentions, our policy responses will inevitably be incoherent at best and contradictory at worst. It would be like a team of physicians looking at a patient, but they're all confused and in disagreement about what the diagnosis is. And so they nevertheless all variously try to treat the symptoms at the same time. But it's also critically important not only that we have a shared diagnosis, but that we have the correct diagnosis, or at least the best one that we can come up with. So I offer my own views of what North Korean leadership motivations and intentions are, especially in regard to nuclear weapons. And then after that, I discuss some of the most debated and most misunderstood, I believe, elements of the North Korea problem. Military option, regime collapse, unification, sanctions, negotiations, a nuclear freeze. North Korea's demands for an end to the U.S.-South Korean military exercises, a peace treaty, human rights, and humanitarian aid. I hope that my arguments about these are a little different and that they'll at least contribute a little bit to narrowing the debate that we have so that we don't just continue to talk about North Korea policy in terms of buzzwords. If I hear one more time that we must deal with North Korea as it is, not as we wish it were, I will scream. But that's one of many. Finally, the paper offers some specific recommendations for the Trump administration's North Korea policy and briefly discusses to what extent these may or may not accord with Mr. Trump's own predilections. So now let me begin by highlighting some of the paper's main points and add some arguments that are not in the paper. First, it seems to me that there's a near consensus among Korea watchers that North Korea may become able to credibly threaten the United States with a nuclear attack during President Trump's term in office. Previous American leaders have declared this to be unacceptable. And Mr. Trump himself has indicated he sees North Korea as one of the most urgent problems he faces. So I think it's very clear he needs to put his North Korea team and policy in place as quickly as possible, both to address the growing and accelerating nuclear threat, and because Pyongyang could very well stage some other problematic event or provocation in the coming weeks and months. Next, I offer an explanation of what I think American priorities on the Korean Peninsula historically have been, based on how American leaders and governments have actually acted. Now, even if President Trump wants to change American policy, it's self-evident that his policy review needs to be based on a solid understanding of the U.S. basic interest in Korea and the policy we've pursued so far. I argue that the United States has had three top strategic priorities on the Korean Peninsula. First, to protect, nurture, and promote our South Korean ally. Second, while doing that, insofar as possible, to avoid another war on the Korean Peninsula. And third, more recently, since about 3 decades ago, to prevent and now to roll back North Korea's nuclear weapons development program. Now, I suspect that many Americans and South Koreans won't agree that these have been the three top priorities, and particularly in that order. I know that some South Koreans believe that the United States is in their country only for its own selfish strategic interests, such as to counter first the USSR or now the PRC. But I don't think they understand how U.S. interests on the Korean Peninsula were fundamentally redefined by the loss of American blood and treasure in the Korean War, so that American presidents subsequently felt that the loss of South Korea would be unacceptable to the United States as much for domestic political reasons as for strategic reasons. You could say that the deaths of nearly 34,000 American soldiers or military personnel in the Korean War turned South Korea's interest into America's interest. And that remains the case. And some observers, both in South Korea and the United States, have speculated that the United States and North Korea might have wanted and possibly could have developed a strategic relationship with each other as the Cold War ended, if only the United States had been more strategic and more diplomatic. But I don't believe that was ever going to happen. Because of the history and the nature and the behavior of the Pyongyang regime, the United States could never have developed fully normal relations with North Korea in the best of circumstances. Moreover, from the end of the Korean War, the United States was thoroughly committed to the Republic of Korea. And as the decades passed and the Republic of Korea completely outclassed North Korea militarily, economically, politically, and diplomatically, it made Seoul even more important to the United States. I'm sure many of you remember that when the George W. Bush administration was trying to justify its Iraq policy, many of its top personnel said, just look at South Korea and Japan. Look what a success we made of that. So South Korea has become one of, in the mythology of American foreign and security policy in the post-World War II era, has become one of our great success stories. So it's very important to that image we have of ourselves. So this is what South Korea has to offer us. What does North Korea have to offer us? There's nothing positive that North Korea can offer us that we would want. But it only has three negative things that it could offer us. A lot of people like to use the 3 no's. I have a different 3 no's. No threatening of our South Korean ally, no nuclear weapons, and no mistreatment of your own people. But as I explain in the paper, Pyongyang has neither been willing nor able to stop doing those 3 things. As for the United States' priority on avoiding another war on the Korean Peninsula, many people believe that the United States almost went to war with South Korea in 1994. This is based on statements by Bill Perry, who, as Secretary of Defense at the time, later said he had ordered contingency planning for a possible attack on North Korea's nuclear facilities. And in South Korea, this thinking is based even more on the late President Kim Jong-un's memoirs, which have not been unfortunately have not been translated into English, as far as I know. President Kim said he assessed that the United States was going to attack North Korea in 1994, and that it was only because he telephoned President Clinton and harangued him in a long telephone conversation that that did not occur. But if you examine what Bill Perry has actually said and written, it's true, he did order contingency planning, but he did so on his own authority, as a matter of prudence. He never presented the plans to the president, and he himself would not have recommended the use of such plans to the president because of the risk of an attack by North Korea on Seoul in response. As for President Kim, his version is simply incorrect. He either genuinely misunderstood American intentions and the situation, or he was seeking to embellish his image in South Korea, or perhaps both. As I said, ending North Korea's nuclear weapons program was only the United States' number 3 priority. If it had been a higher priority, the United States might actually have seriously considered using the military to destroy Pyongyang's nuclear and missile facilities. Now, however, with North Korea approaching the capability of having the ability to attack the United States with nuclear weapons, the question arises, will protecting the United States itself trump, so to speak, protecting South Korea and avoiding another nuclear war, Korean war, in terms of U.S. interest? In other words, might the U.S. military or U.S. president order the military to destroy North Korea's WMD facilities to protect the United States from a possible North Korean attack? And I just had a discussion with Alan Romberg, and when I finish, I'll ask him to make the point that he was making to me, to all of you, related to this. Or, on the other hand, might the United States be unwilling to risk trading San Francisco or Seattle for Seoul and seek instead to appease Pyongyang, even at the risk of undermining South Korea's vital interest in our alliance with South Korea? I think South Koreans are divided as to what they think the United States is likely to do. Many probably think we'll continue more or less on our current course and think that everything just repeats itself. And some may think that that is riskier now, and some may think it's not been all that risky. There's been a tendency for South Koreans to get inured to the situation. But some others may think that the United States might actually not be willing to risk an attack on the United States to protect Seoul. And those people sometimes think that South Korea should develop its own nuclear weapons, or at least induce Washington to reintroduce American tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea. And finally, some, I would say on this point, South Korean progressives tend to think there's relatively little risk to their country in the United States appeasing Pyongyang, and many of them hope that the Trump administration will negotiate intensively with North Korea and be generous with the regime, that is, pursue an American version of the Sunshine Policy. Now, I'm not going to try to predict what course the Trump administration will choose, but in my paper I argue that the fate of South Korea and our alliance with it remains very important to the United States. I don't believe that either risking war by using a military option or appeasing North Korea is an attractive option for the United States. Both would put both U.S. and South Korean interests severely at risk. That leads me to the next section of my paper, a discussion of North Korean leadership intentions. The American policy response to North Korea's weapons of mass destruction programs could be very different depending upon what our assessment is, of North Korea's intentions and how nuclear weapons fit into that. That's because the threat posed by North Korea's WMD is a product of both its capabilities and of how its leaders intend to use them. So, if North Korea is only trying, as it itself claims, to deter the United States from attacking and threatening it, That is, if its nuclear weapons program is purely defensive and has limited aims, the United States' response might conceivably be to offer negotiations on the basis of North Korea being a nuclear weapons state, seek ways to reassure it, and accept its possession of a limited nuclear weapons capability for the indefinite future. Now, that's basically the nuclear freeze or cap proposal. If, on the other hand, American leaders fear that North Korea is too roguelike to preclude its using nuclear weapons against the United States one day, it's conceivable that American leaders might at some point feel forced to destroy the country's nuclear and missile facilities. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have any credible real-time intelligence about North Korean leadership intentions. We can only infer their intentions. Our basis for doing that, among other things, is what they've done in the past, their public and private statements, or assessments of the pressures, both foreign and domestic, under which they're operating, the personality of Kim Jong-un and the people around him, and so forth. My own consideration of these factors has led me to offer the following theory in the paper. I think it's certain that North Korean leaders have many reasons, both foreign and domestic, for pursuing nuclear weapons. But I cannot agree with the theory that North Korea is just a poor victim responding only to external threats against it and seeking only to counter such threats and defend itself. On the other hand, I don't think that North Korean leaders are very likely to have actually considered attacking the United States with nuclear weapons or other countries, especially American allies, because they haven't yet given evidence of being suicidal. North Korean leaders talk about the threat from the United States, but I think that their deepest fear is of their own people, especially that one day they might realize how much more successful the other Korean state to their south is, and that when the people do so, they will rise up against them. I respect the intelligence of the North Korean leadership. I believe that North Koreans are human beings like you and I are, and so that's what I base this assumption on. So for North Korean leaders, the logical conclusion is that their aim must be to somehow neuter and ideally get rid of the South Korean state as soon as possible. And to do that, the biggest impediment, I believe they feel, is the US-ROK alliance. So they need to get rid of that because the US protected South Korea and helped it in many ways, and because we've, at the same time, done all we can to put pressure and harm North Korea. So it's entirely logical that they would want to get rid of us and the alliance. And the historical record is clear. North Korea has consistently sought to end the alliance. It's attacked all aspects of the alliance. And it has also, at the same time, consistently sought to undermine South Korea through various means, which I mention more in detail in the paper. So I believe that North Korea's leaders aim to use the existence of an eventual credible threat to attack the United States with nuclear weapons to force a negotiations process with the United States on North Korean terms intended to undermine the US-ROK alliance and thus ultimately make the Republic of Korea itself vulnerable. So to go back to my medical analogy, I believe that nuclear weapons are the symptom, are one of the symptoms, not the disease. The disease is more fundamental. Do I think that the North Koreans can achieve that goal? No. I think they're seriously overestimating their own capabilities and seriously underestimating the strength of the Republic of Korea, of the United States, and of our alliance. But if I were a North Korean leader, and I suspect if many of you were in that position, facing enormous challenges at home and abroad, nuclear weapons would look like the closest thing to a panacea you could find. A very effective tool to try to achieve their ultimate purposes. And even if they didn't for a long time, it would serve other purposes as well in their own mind. So I invite you to read the section about this in the paper where I offer a more detailed explanation of my reasoning. The paper next addresses various aspects of the North Korea problem from the perspective of the theory of leadership intentions that I've just outlined. So let me run down the list of those things, just summarizing them. First, the military option. If my theory of North Korean leadership intentions is correct, and North Korean leaders are not suicidal, a U.S. military option wouldn't make much sense, I don't think. The risk of using it would be many and great, the advantages uncertain and limited. Second, regime collapse. I argue in the paper that the North Korean regime is like cast iron. It's very hard, but also brittle. It is inevitable that one day it will experience what I like to call a dramatic disjuncture. But we have no way of knowing when that will be, how it will recur, and whether the resulting situation will be worse or better for our interest. And in any event, we don't have any confidence that we could make the regime collapse, at least not in the way we would like it to happen, that is, peacefully or relatively peacefully and forward-looking. The bottom line is that we can't count on good luck or regime collapse to take care of North Korea's problem, the problem that we have with North Korea. Third, and related to the regime collapse notion, I think all Americans that I've ever met, and certainly I myself, would love to see peaceful unification and democracy in all of Korea. But that doesn't really fit into the picture of our strategy for dealing with the current North Korea problem and the North Korean nuclear problem in particular. Because, as I've said, we can't count on regime collapse, and I don't see unification occurring any other way in the foreseeable future. In fact, this is kind of gratuitous, but I think we'd better be careful about what we wish for. I think unification could be a disaster for American interest, and for Koreans too, if it doesn't occur when the people of both North and South Korea avidly want it and are in agreement that their country should be democratic. That is definitely not the case today. Fourth, sanctions. I argue that sanctions are both useful and necessary. They serve many purposes. They have helped to uphold the global non-proliferation regime. They have complicated North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons. They have weakened its economy. Partly because of sanctions, South Korea's annual margin of growth is probably larger than the North Korea's entire economy. That is a strategic disaster for North Korea's leaders. Now, to those who say that sanctions have not worked and cannot work, I suggest they engage in a thought experiment. What would the situation likely be like today had we not had such sanctions? I could say more about that, but I have more in the paper. Fifth, negotiations. Some critics insist that the United States agree to negotiate unconditionally with North Korea and ask, what could it hurt? The answer, as I detail in the paper, is that under the current circumstances, that is, given North Korea's position that it is unwilling to not only to give up nuclear weapons, but unwilling to negotiate about it, an unconditional American return to formal negotiations with North Korea would certainly not help and would probably cause serious problems, making the situation worse for both the U.S. and South Korean interest. Again, I base this assessment on my assessment of North Korean leadership intentions. To those who say, well, I understand that, or I agree to some extent with that argument, we still really need to stay in touch with the North Koreans to prevent misunderstandings and miscalculations. I explain in the paper that, to a large extent, we're already doing that without returning to formal negotiations. I argue that the problem is not that Washington and Pyongyang do not know and understand their respective policies and aims. It's that they know each other's policies and aims all too well. Moreover, the United States has basically never refused to engage in principle, has never refused in principle to talk with North Korea since we began doing so in 1992. In fact, the frank truth is that both Washington and Pyongyang would love to negotiate with each other. So the question is not whether to negotiate, but on whose terms. The United States is not willing to negotiate on the basis of North Korea being a legitimate nuclear weapons state, and North Korea is not currently willing to negotiate on any other basis. And that leads to the sixth notion of a nuclear freeze or cap. I believe that a cap is absolutely unacceptable in terms of American interest. It would constitute a de facto acknowledgement and U.S. acceptance of North Korea as at least a limited nuclear weapons state for the indefinite future. I think that would be disastrous for the global nonproliferation regime, for the message it would send to Iran about its own nuclear aspirations, and for U.S. alliances not only with Seoul and Tokyo, but throughout the world. Well, then what about a freeze? Now, a freeze is highly desirable in principle because it would help to slow down the pace of North Korea's programs, but only if it were a genuine freeze, and that is, among other things, a complete freeze and verified freeze, and only if there were sufficient grounds to believe that it would be actually, truly, a stepping stone to complete denuclearization. But given North Korea's current attitude and position, a freeze would just be a cap in disguise, and thus equally unacceptable. No one in the world would be fooled into thinking that a freeze under the current circumstances would actually be a stepping stone to denuclearization. And so the consequences would be the same as the conclusion or negotiation of a cap. So in the paper, I analyzed the freeze notion a little further, and I asked 7 specific questions about it that I have never heard any advocate of a freeze address, much less answer. Until they do, and do so convincingly, and I would be happy if they could do so, the freeze notion will be a mirage, constantly receding the more one tries to approach it. And it will also remain just a distraction from the real problem and real solutions. 7th, the North Koreans have long demanded an end to U.S.-South Korean military exercises and a peace treaty with the United States. This is completely cynical. It is part of their propaganda portraying themselves as innocent victims and their actions as entirely defensive. In fact, to repeat myself, their aim is the end of the U.S.-ROK alliance, all the better to undermine the South. If not, why were the North Koreans so utterly unwilling to discuss military tension reduction and confidence-building measures and the other elements of a peace treaty when these were offered, indeed pressed upon them, for 2 years during the 4-party talks? Now, those talks, for those younger folks here, were held during the Bill Clinton administration, and they led by U.S. officials who were eager to achieve a peace treaty. The Chinese were also a member of those talks. So today, when the Chinese argue for a peace treaty or parallel peace talks and denuclearization talks, my response to them is to ask for their own recollection of their participation in those 4-party talks and the North Korean position in it, and ask them, is there any reason more today to expect that the North Koreans would be more reasonable and forthcoming about the substance of a peace treaty than they were in 1997? I think not. I mean, the obvious answer is that they would be far less reasonable. 8th, human rights and humanitarian aid. Since the end of the Cold War, the international community has increasingly focused on Pyongyang as the world's worst systematic violator of human rights. And coincidentally, the IT revolution has made North Korea, even a country like North Korea, much more transparent to the world. As a consequence, organizations have formed all over the world to advocate for the North Korean people and their human rights. More recently, the United States has become much more active in this effort. And in a very dramatic step, which I don't think enough attention was paid to or notice was given to, the United States earlier this year designated Kim Jong-un as personally responsible for the human rights situation in his country. That's putting him on notice that we may very well, we're laying the basis for and might try at some point to put him on trial for crimes against his own people. That is a tremendous change in policy and very, very significant. Now, I personally think I support those efforts. I think they're entirely correct. But in the paper, as an analyst, and to be honest, I also note that this focus on human rights, and especially putting responsibility for them so personally on the regime's top leadership, will probably complicate, or will complicate, a negotiated settlement of the Korean problem, North Korea problem, if we ever get to that point. And finally, on this list, as for humanitarian aid, the United States has, as you know, not provided such aid to North Korea for many years now. I believe it makes no sense to give humanitarian aid to North Korea when U.S. and international supplies are already insufficient to meet all international needs, and their needs in other countries equally as serious as those in North Korea. That's especially the case when North Korea prioritizes, its government prioritizes WMD programs directed against us above the needs of its own people. So I believe that giving North Korean aid, humanitarian aid under the current circumstances, would in fact be to treat that regime preferentially over other countries, in effect, in response to blackmail, or at least as an effort at appeasement. I think humanitarian aid should be resumed by the United States only as part of a comprehensive settlement. I conclude the paper with some recommendations for the Trump administration and thoughts about whether they might fit. Again, importantly, these are based on my assessment of North Korean leadership intentions. If your assessment is different, then your recommendations will be different. So I argue that the United States cannot accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, ever, not even as a limited one, promising not to proliferate, not even under the guise of a freeze. On the other hand, I argue that it's not necessary and wouldn't make sense to use a military option against North Korea. Instead, based on a clear-eyed understanding of North Korea's strategic aims, that is, to end the US-ROK alliance and then hope that they can subvert South Korea, we should carefully craft sanctions and inducements intended to convince North Korea's leaders that the U.S. is determined to ensure that their pursuit of WMD will cost them more than it will ever gain them, and that we will never, ever give up or give in. To that, the United States needs to focus on the psychology of the top leaders in North Korea, focusing on those sanctions that will contribute to that goal. So that's on the one hand. On the other, we need to underline to both Pyongyang and Beijing that the United States' goal is not regime collapse or instability in North Korea, but it really is complete and verifiable denuclearization. And we should reinforce that position by looking to see if we can be more specific about what the United States would be willing to do for a deal on complete denuclearization. And then I do offer a few thoughts about how the recommendations might fit in with the Trump administration's predilections. I think it's possible that this will be a reasonably good fit. President-elect Trump has stressed the importance of strength, but he's also repeatedly said he's willing to talk with other regimes, with adversaries. I think it's probable that the new administration will reject any consideration of a North Korean freeze or cap, in part because of the signal it would send to Iran. As for the human rights policy, Mr. Trump has been extremely critical of the situation in Cuba. The situation in North Korea is incomparably worse. So I don't know how he's going to look at the human rights situation in North Korea, but it would be very inconsistent if he did not pursue that with some vigor. Let me conclude by offering you the bottom line as I see it. I think the North Korea problem is worse than it ever has been in some ways, and it's going to probably continue to get even worse before it gets better. I don't think the preceding 4 U.S. administrations were unable to resolve the North Korea problem because they were stupid or malevolent or lazy or distracted. I think it was because the North Koreans feel under great threat from their own people, and thus by extension from the United States and its South Korean ally. The situation for Pyongyang's leaders is a matter of life and death, not only for their regime, but for their own persons and their family and friends. They've thus focused a tremendous amount of their limited resources and of their attention on dealing with the United States and South Korea. And while their system is an anachronism, it's dangerous, it's abhorrent, the North Korean leaders are people, and they're just as smart as we are. So the regime is much more formidable and determined than many in South Korea and the United States and elsewhere like to imagine. On the other hand, and I wish I could go in much greater length about this, but I'll just make the point. We shouldn't sell ourselves short. The United States is one hell of a powerful country. And as Joe Biden once said in South Korea, I believe, and was badly misunderstood, don't bet against the United States. I certainly wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the North Korean leaders facing the combined resources of the United States and the Republic of Korea, much less the pretty much united will of the international community. So that's why I believe that if the next administration pursues a clear-eyed policy, practices deft diplomacy, and really significantly increases resources to back up this policy, especially sanctions implementation, and otherwise summons the necessary political will, North Korea will not be able to continue indefinitely on its current course. Either Kim Jong-un will reconsider his position, or others in the elite in North Korea will reconfigure the leadership in a direction more in tune with American and South Korean interests. One final note about more recent factors. All of what I've said here depends on the political situation in both Washington and Seoul, obviously. And there's a great deal of uncertainty about both. Will President Trump focus on the Korean Peninsula, or will he change U.S.-China relations in such a way and to such an extent that Beijing will not cooperate even half-heartedly with the United States on North Korea? And might a new government in Seoul seek to revert to the Sunshine Policy? That would probably create a tremendous gap. It would certainly undermine the policy that the United States has pursued vis-a-vis North Korea since the Obama administration. The answer to both questions is, of course, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows yet. Thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Great. Well, actually, I had prepared several questions for you on what you just addressed in the last part. You said you don't know, but I'm going to have to pry you a little bit more. In your paper, to talk about a little bit more about China, you had said the United States may yet achieve its aims with something less than China's complete cooperation, going on to say to obtain greater cooperation from Beijing on the North Korea problem. However, President Trump should reconsider some of his statements about PRC policy, including his call for high tariffs on imports from China. Now, there's a growing sentiment that I think you sort of tried to address at the end there, that holds the key to the U.S. policy in North Korea in China. And there's already tensions over THAAD, and it doesn't look like Trump will back down on his trade rhetoric, and we see that through the Taiwan call earlier in the last week. How much do you expect these policies to work if China isn't completely on board, as you said in your paper?
Yes, a good question. As I said in the paper, I don't think we necessarily have to have full Chinese cooperation to achieve our ends and defend American and South Korean interests on the Korean Peninsula. But if we have no Chinese cooperation, then that will create a completely different situation in terms of the big picture strategy and diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula. No one can predict exactly how that would turn out, but we would have something more like a forced China DPRK alliance situation, and I don't know if China would at the same time be then able to put more pressure on North Korea to be a little less provocative or slow down its nuclear program, but it might not feel any real desire to do so. Who knows what China might do. Again, I think we can go around the world, as the Obama administration and South Korea in recent months especially has started to do. We can put a heck of a lot of pressure on the North Koreans, even without all the full Chinese cooperation. But at some point, once we've done all we can do with the current Chinese cooperation and everything else that we do plus alpha over what we've started to do in the rest of the world, if the North Koreans still have not done what we need them to do, then we're obviously logically going to need more Chinese cooperation. So, but if President Trump continues to say and do some of the things he's done, I'm not a China expert. Alan or other of you who are China experts, I welcome your views, but I just think as a matter of common sense, China will significantly reduce its cooperation with us on the North Korea problem.
And something else that's obviously on everyone else's mind, which you addressed at the end of your remarks there, was the elections in South Korea. And it's increasingly looking like we'll have elections before December next year, and that if the opposition were to transition into power in South Korea, that there might be a possibility for a return to some sort of sunshine policy engagement. And as you mentioned in your paper, or in your remarks, and as well as in your paper, the U.S. should continue to show its dedication to sanctions. Do you think if South Korea were to revert to a sunshine policy, there might be room for the United States to have a coordinated policy of outreach and engagement toward towards the North Koreans, or should the United States continue to maintain this hardline policy against the North?
Well, as I've argued in the paper, I don't think that's a wise approach. I don't think it's the best approach. On the other hand, we're on the South Korean peninsula and have been since 1950 to protect South Korea, and South Korea is our ally. And if that is to have any meaning, our two governments must cooperate together. So if there's a new South Korean government that pursues a sunshine policy, as I put in the paper, I don't think the United States can or should fully embrace it. But on the other hand, we can't fully reject our ally. One of the great, one of my greatest disagreements as Korea director during the George W. Bush administration was not that George W. Bush found Kim Jong-un and his regime abhorrent. I agreed with him. It was that his diplomacy was so absent, his ability to, his understanding of the regional dynamics and ability to influence the actors was virtually non-existent. By not being more subtle and more diplomatic in dealing with Kim Dae-jung about the sunshine policy, we caused enormous problems both for South Korea and for ourselves. So there would have to be, I would recommend, if there's a sunshine policy again in South Korea, that we carefully analyze who the leaders are and exactly what version of the sunshine policy it is, and be, as friends and allies, be clear but polite in saying this is something we can't accept, this we might be able to work with. And under those circumstances, I can see myself, if I were advising a U.S. government, of saying, okay, if you want to engage North Korea, we're comfortable with this and this and this type of engagement, but in the process, we really think you must work with them, press them on the nuclear program. And in particular, I don't think the U.S. government now, or in that case, should oppose if South Korean top leaders want to meet with the North Koreans. I think at almost any time, if the South Koreans want to meet with the North Koreans and the North Koreans are willing, that's not a bad thing, and in fact could be a good thing and should occur. So I could imagine a new South Korean leader meeting with Kim Jong-un. And I'm very skeptical, but I'm open to the possibility and would hope that that would lead to some openings that might also contribute to, to easing tensions and reducing the risk of an accidental war, and possibly leading to some path towards a genuine denuclearization negotiation that also meets North Korea's legitimate needs.
Thank you very much for those great answers. And at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Please wait for the microphone before you ask your question and state your name and affiliation. I think we'll go to Alan first. Yeah.
Alan Romberg at the Stimson Center. David, thank you very much. That was terrific. And I've read most of the paper since I've been here, and it's well worth everybody taking the time to do that. There's one point I might disagree with you about, and I'll raise it at the end. But what we discussed before really goes to the point of, will the sanctions work? And if they don't work, where are we? And my point is that if North Korea has what we genuinely believe, not think, not speculate, not estimate, but genuinely believe, has a nuclear weapons capability, that is a warhead that can be successfully mounted on an ICBM, so that not only can Pyongyang attack its neighbors, but also the United States with nuclear weapons. And in that circumstance, it raises an ICBM on a launch pad. Whether the United States president really will feel he has the option to say, gee, you know, I don't think that would be logical for them to do because they know we would come back and obliterate them, so I'll just wait and see what they do. In other words, he may feel absolutely compelled to do something to take out that capability, physically, militarily. My point in raising that is that while I agree with you about all of the concerns about China, I think we need to be very forthcoming with the Chinese and say this is a real possibility. We don't know, but what you and we and the South Koreans need to do is work together now in an effective way not to get to that point. And I agree about China not seeing the picture the same way. In fact, I think they have not changed their strategic assessment. North Korea won't do that. Therefore, the U.S. won't do what I'm suggesting. But I think they need to face some reality. And granted, there is the day after consideration, which is huge. But that's why we should never get to that point. So that was what I was trying to say. The one point on which I have some question is your rejection of a freeze. I don't know how we'd get there. I don't know what the circumstances would be and so on. But it does seem to me it is not in our interest or anybody else's interest for them to continue to develop their capabilities, which is involved in what I just said about the horrible circumstance we might face at some point. So how would you rate the, I accept the point about long-term capping has all sorts of bad effects, but long-term continuation of their development of nuclear weaponry and missiles also has some really potentially horrible effects. So can you address that a little bit more?
Again, it's not that I oppose a nuclear freeze, but that I don't see it as happening. And I don't see a genuine freeze as happening. Let's see, where are my questions here? Let me just read this in case I think many people have not had a chance to. I say, while a freeze on North Korea's nuclear and missile development would be highly desirable, the closer one examines the concept, the less plausible it becomes as a real option. The most recent U.S. effort at a negotiated freeze, and we've had many before, was the 2012 Leap Day deal. And almost immediately, North Korea spectacularly violated it. So, I mean, the first question is, would the North Koreans be amenable to almost any kind of a freeze other than the most cynical, partial, unverified? So I say that fundamental issues with the freeze remain unanswered by its advocates. For example, even if North Korea entered into another freeze, would it be willing to apply it to all or almost all of its facilities? But how would we know, even if it said it was? We don't, I'm sure we don't know where many of the facilities are at. Another uranium enrichment facility, bomb fabrication facilities, scientist research facilities. Would it allow verification? Where? How much? And how long would we expect Pyongyang to maintain a freeze? And the other thing about the freeze notion, that when people talk about it, that I don't think they've really thought through, at least not through hard, is what should the United States be willing to provide North Korea in exchange for a freeze? Now, if the North Koreans offer it for free, even maybe if it's only a partial freeze, well, okay, fine. I'm fine with that. But I don't expect them to do that. They're not even talking about it in exchange for benefits at this point, or not willing to. What would Pyongyang demand from the United States now, especially, to enter into a freeze? And what else might it demand to continue it? So once we enter into a freeze, we're still subject to them at any time hinting or saying outright, you know, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, we're going to leave this, unless you do X, Y, and Z. And if, as likely, the North Koreans soon violate the freeze, what position are we in then? How do we respond? Are we still in a better position than if we had not had the freeze or not? I'm not sure that the answer to that is clear-cut. And think of the politics of this. I mean, we're here, I think most of us are not politicians. We want to think about what's right and what's the right thing to do and how does this fit strategically. But politics is the fish is the water in which the fish swim. And in the Leap Day deal, which I say 5 years, 3 nuclear tests, and scores of missile launches ago, the Obama administration was willing or able politically to offer only food aid, basically, in exchange for a partial North Korean freeze agreement. Now, North Korea would almost certainly demand far more for a freeze, including, as it has recently publicly, an end to U.S. military exercises and a peace treaty on Pyongyang's terms. So I do not oppose a freeze. It's just I've seen so many people, that's in private and in public, some people, Americans and some South Koreans, when they're talking about at least ameliorating the situation, a near-term fix, it's almost always the freeze. But I've never found anybody to answer these questions to say how it would happen and how it would be politically feasible. And unless people are able to have some sort of plausible answer to those questions, what we're doing, because the North Koreans are listening to this, I mean, they're not listening to me right now, I don't think we're wired, but I'll bet you that the North Korean diplomats at the UN mission have already read this because it was posted yesterday, and I know for a fact that they sit, and other North Koreans elsewhere in North Korea, sit all day long and they follow what we say, because this stuff is important to them. Even what David Straub says is important to them, and somebody there is going to read it. And they know that we sit around talking about, oh gosh, we're in such a bad spot, we've got to get a freeze. So, yeah, a freeze would be great, but somebody come up with a realistic plan to actually achieve one. If not, we should stop talking about it until the circumstances allow for a realistic freeze. And by the way, thank you very much for the question, and especially for those comments. I had not thought as clearly about those as you, and my only regret is that I hadn't before and hadn't put it in the paper. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David, Kyle. I want to thank Alan for his opening remark, because that was precisely my question. But I was going to ask in a slightly different way. But first, fabulous talk and paper, David. But you used the appeasement word three times, and that makes me nervous. And I want you to,
may I interrupt just a second?
Please.
And you can follow up after I say this. I use it because it's an accurate and precise word. I am not using it, and I know that it has this terrible Hitlerian connotation, but I'm using it because I can't think of a more precise and accurate term to describe what we really are talking about. I mean, you could use the word accommodation and so forth, but I'm using it, I guess, in the political science sense of appeasement, and I'm using it as an extreme. I don't oppose, doing some things North Korea likes, depending upon what it brings to us. So I'm using it as an extreme. On one pole, is appeasement, on the other is a military response.
Well, okay, but it still makes me nervous. And the reason it makes me nervous, and I would have said this even before President Park's horrendous difficulties, most people think there's a pretty good chance now the opposition's coming back. So most people think there's a pretty good chance we're going to get some, son of or granddaughter of sunshine. So we want to be careful about using the appeasement word if the sitting elected government of South Korea is pursuing stuff that we've sort of already defined as appeasement. Boy, it's a disconnect that we're creating by definition. Number one. Number two, and maybe it's more of a statement than a question, but, it's called the Korean Peninsula, not the American Peninsula. And if the South Korean government is willing to make a deal with North Korea, we better damn well be ready to accommodate to that, right? Or not. I'd like to see more discussion of that because the bottom line is, I think, precisely what Alan led with. And I think that's the most critical question, isn't it? If nothing really changes, the Norks are going to have an ICBM that could hit us. So we have a choice, right? Do we try to preempt or do we appease, right? And I think if we're going to discuss that, we need to discuss, can we, in fact, tolerate a North Korea with an ICBM if, as you say, there's no evidence they are actually suicidal? They may be SOBs, they may be doing terrible, actual horrible things, but it's about personal regime survival. So I think we need to broaden the discussion of what is acceptable to us if we are not able or willing to fight a war to get what we want. So that's really a two-pointer.
Yeah.
Sunshine, it's coming back. And, why is that not appeasement? And if we have to live with an ICBM North Korea because we can't fight them, we need to talk more about that. So thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Chris Nelson Report. Sorry, I forgot the advertisement.
Thank you, Chris. I think those are useful comments and good points as raises questions. As far as appeasement and accommodation as terminology are concerned, I don't advocate the U.S. government using the word appeasement. If I were a U.S. official, I wouldn't. But I am a free man. For 10 years, I have been a free man. It feels really good not to have to repeat a government talking points about government policy. So I'm being frank. I think it is, in a social science sense of the term, an appeasement policy. And
This Kim Jong-un now.
right, or Trump. I think it is technically an appeasement policy, and while I was not using it in a derogatory sense, I myself am critical of the Sunshine Policy. I think it was well-intentioned, but based on an incorrect interpretation of North Korean leadership intentions, not only vis-a-vis the United States, but, as I said, more fundamentally against the United States. But I will take under advisement your concern that David Straub, using the word appeasement, might cause grief in the broader world. As for it being the Korean Peninsula, that's certainly true. And I've long been a strong supporter and advocate of being a good partner and ally with the South Koreans because of that. On the other hand, to be blunt, it's also the American Peninsula. And it's that way because of our history of involvement on it. Now, we're not involved in South Korean politics. We're not involved in most South Korean things. But when it comes to the success or the survival of South Korea, we're still involved. Now, perhaps Mr. Trump will change that. I doubt it. I doubt it. At the end of the day, I suspect and hope that his policy will tend, as time goes by, to become more conventional and more consistent with past policy, we can hope. So if we have a sunshine policy in South Korea and they want to make deals with North Korea, it depends on the deal. Some things the U.S. can agree with. Some things the U.S. will think are actually good. Some things the U.S. will not particularly like, but because of our, the need to have a united public front and to be able to talk frankly and to cooperate to the maximum extent possible, we will need to accept. but I can imagine there will be some deals that will be unacceptable to the United States, and we'll probably say that and need to say that. As for a freeze and North Korea shortly having this capability, I fully understand that this is a really bad situation. And I fully understand that my own interpretation that we would not necessarily need to use a military attack on North Korea's nuclear capabilities or missile capabilities will not be shared by other Americans. Other people have had different experiences. I myself acknowledge my interpretation of North Korean leaders' fundamental intentions may be wrong. Would any president want to bet the security of an American city from a North Korean nuclear attack on David Straub's theory? Probably not. But I wanted to throw it out on the table because I think what I presented, including that, is a little different than what most people have presented. It's an individual perspective on this problem, so I think it's relatively coherent. It may be totally cockeyed, but it's relatively coherent, internally coherent, logically. So if we have so even if we get some sort of a nuclear freeze, again, so you're saying, and I agree, that we may just be a few years out from North Korea doing this. And at any point after that freeze, they can, as they've repeatedly done, find excuses and pretexts to say it's off, and we're still back to the 2 or 3 year timeline. So I color me, for the moment, I think our focus should be on finding more resources and more ways of putting more pressure, carefully thought out pressure on the North Korean top leadership and see if that will work. I know we're running against, there's a timeline here, and we're going to cross at some point with North Korea getting that full nuclear weapons capability. Then we'll be in the position in which Alan has discussed.
Keep it back.
Thanks, Kyle. David, thank you for the very in-depth approach. As you know, the North Korean leadership is most repressive, killing off elites, creating a high level of anxiety among the elites. On the other hand, he is loosening up. He's allowing so many in his country to learn about the basics of business, how to transition to a market economy. There's a lot of churning occurring within North Korea, cross currents, dynamics, new dynamics. Given your expertise, your background, your sleeping North Korea for years, what are some potential black swan scenarios or situations that could possibly occur as a result of all these moving parts now within the North that we don't typically anticipate or discuss on a regular basis?
Thanks, Keith. That's, I guess, that's a tough question. I mean, I think the definition of black swans is what we can't predict. So, I mean, going back to the question of regime collapse, you know, I was a much younger person in 1994 and 5. At that time, I was at the American Embassy in Tokyo in the political section, and I remember all of these senior diplomats and intel and military people coming to talk with the American ambassador over dinner at his residence. And they were all so confident that after Kim Il-sung's death that North Korea, I still remember some of them would say, I give them 18 months at the most, 2 years. No, they absolutely can't go more than 5 years. So I was so much younger and inexperienced that I thought, wow, these are really important, smart people. They must know what they're talking about. But I just don't see it, but they must know what they're talking about. Of course, I wasn't in a position to act on any of that, so it didn't matter. But in looking back, a few years later, I said, you know, got to be aware of people, including top officials, just pulling things out of their rear end, because we're human beings, they're human beings, and they do it. So I'm very skeptical right now that regime collapse will occur anytime soon. I think I agree with you. You're much more informed about what's going on inside North Korea than I am, but it's clear there's been a lot of marketization, there's a lot of cell phones and everything. And other things being equal, I think that's terrific, and over the long term, I think that's a positive. Unfortunately, the pace of the North Korean nuclear program has made that irrelevant. So 25 years ago, we were looking for and applauding every possible indication of liberalization and reform in North Korea. At this point, it's irrelevant in terms of our strategic interests, particularly as regards the North Korean nuclear program, because the timeline is just is not right. As for black swans, I mean, as I said, it's a regime like cast iron, so I wouldn't guarantee you, though, that overnight, or even as we're speaking here, somebody doesn't go out and shoot Kim Jong-un. Sometimes something like that could very well happen. So something like that's possible. I suppose it's possible that there could be a coup there. But I'm skeptical about that this will do us all that much good, because I don't have this notion that apparently some people have that that it's all going to happen based on analogy with East and West Germany. I think they're two very different societies, different cultures, different histories, different institutions, and the North Korean people have been indoctrinated for 7 decades and isolated. And if you're a North Korean leader, even one who really wants to get rid of Kim Jong-un, the odds are at least as great that you want to get rid of him for reasons other than being more democratic and nice to the Westerners. So I could see a situation in which you have a worse leadership in North Korea. If the regime starts having instability, I can't imagine it just collapsing and then somebody inviting us in or we inviting ourselves in. What American president would be foolhardy enough to go into a situation like North Korea, where the military still has all of its arms, where there are nuclear weapons, where we don't really know what's going on in real time? We might know a month after the fact what has gone on, but that's too late, right? Probably. So that kind of a black swan event helping us, I'm not counting on. Other black swan events, I'll have to think about that some more. But thanks for challenging me on that. China experts can talk about China turning into a black swan.
Gil?
Gil Rosman, the Outside Forum. David, you didn't bring China very much into your analysis, and you talked about a timeline really in terms of what Trump might do to interfere with what you called China's half-hearted support for the sanctions. I think the timeline that others might have brought in is that when we agreed on Resolution 2230, there was sort of a testing of China. After it took them 2.5, 3 months to agree to this, that if they didn't implement it, the U.S. would do something more drastic. Mm-hmm. And then China didn't implement it significantly. And so now is another testing of China with the new resolution. But isn't it clear that there is already a timetable for China, and many suspect, even independent of Trump, it's not going to do the things that are called for by these resolutions and by the international community, and therefore we are already running towards a deadline where there'll be a U.S.-China showdown with secondary sanctions and more. So how do you interpret this in the context of your presentation and your interpretation of how Trump may damage it all by making China so offended that we don't even have the time to test what it might really do to cooperate.
Thank you, Gil. I agree we're on that trajectory, we're on that track, but I don't think we're there yet. I think we still have a couple of years probably to try something like the approach that I've suggested. And you probably, I'm sure you know better than I do, but I get the sense that the Chinese leaders and people are divided about North Korea, and I think that is partly the reason their record on sanctions has been mixed. On the one hand, I get the sense that after the 2006 test, that the Chinese were sort of motivated to offer the North Koreans more, to engage in more economic cooperation, hoping that their own version of the Sunshine Policy and appeasement would work. Of course, it didn't, and if anything, it probably provided more resources for the North Koreans to accelerate their nuclear weapons and missile programs. On the other hand, the Chinese could help the North Koreans a whole lot more. And I think it's safe to say that in some ways the Chinese sanctions have really hurt the North Koreans. And in particular in this latest tranche of sanctions, well, they didn't implement a lot of 2270 and there were a lot of loopholes, but in this one, the U.S. government helped to and succeeded in actually getting a tonnage amount and a dollar limit as a ceiling on coal exports and a total ban on others. Now, I think we still have a couple of years or so, or maybe more, and that we should, maybe this time it will work better, because this is very, very specific. And as I said, apart from that, there are a lot more things that we can do to put that psychological pressure on the leaders of North Korea, apart from the China angle. And I think we should do that because, to me, the other alternatives are worse, or the other options are worse.
General Chen.
General Chen, Rock Army, retired. I'm only asking a question because I want my photo taken, so. So it seems quite obvious that the only way that the Korean Peninsula is going to be truly denuclearized is to get rid of the North Korean, the DPRK. Having said that, how do you feel about the freeze as an intermediate goal or an enticement for the North Koreans to come to the table, to the table? And I just want to make a further comment in saying that the North Korean carrot to us coming to the table is brinkmanship. And every time they do that, especially now, it's more dangerous than ever before because of the situation in South Korea. So how do you feel about that?
Thank you very much, General Chan. So for me, the issue is not getting the North Koreans to the table. I think we could probably get to the table immediately if the U.S. were willing to have unconditional talks with the North Koreans. But President Obama administration has not agreed that that is an American interest, and I personally think that it's not an American interest. However, if we could get to the table and actually make progress on some of the issues that are of concern to us, then I think the Obama administration would be delighted to do that. As for using a freeze to improve the situation, if there were any prospect that we could get a freeze, a complete, verifiable freeze for reasonable compensation from our side, I myself would depend on the details, but that would be fine by me. My problem again is with people who advocate a freeze have not presented a real proposal. They have presented an aspiration, not an end state, an intermediate situation, but not told policymakers or anyone else, how do we get from here to there? And in a way that actually makes it in our interest, that helps us out.
Bill Huang from the University of Maryland. One of the very confusing trend we observed during the past few years was the inconsistency of North Korea's foreign policy. You mentioned the Leap Day Agreement. It just broke up 2 months later. If we remember last year, there were high-level talks between the two Koreas in Incheon and in the DMZ, but to de-escalate the military tension. But just only after several months, things are as they are right now. So I'm wondering, do you think there is a coherent and consistent North Korean foreign policy making process right now, or it's just different departments pursuing their own separate goals and sometimes in conflict with each other, which is more likely the case?
An excellent question. So I put in my paper, and I said here today that the North Koreans are as smart as I am, and probably as smart as most of us in the room, and that they're very, very focused on this because it's a life and death matter to them, and that therefore they're more formidable. They're more serious strategically and diplomatically than most people give them credit for. I do not mean to suggest by that they're Superman. They're human beings, so they're not only smart, but they also make a lot of stupid mistakes, and they can be venal, and they do horrible things to their own people and to the South Koreans. Specifically, in answer to your question, from the time I worked in government, the information that I saw suggested that the so-called stovepiping among the various North Korean bureaucracies and organizations was in which they don't communicate with anybody except top leaders, not with each other, is even more severe than it is it exists in all societies, but it's even more severe in North Korea. I think that seems to have been the case under Kim Jong-il. I assume, if anyone else knows, please speak, that it continues under Kim Jong-un. So, on the one hand, fundamentally, I believe they are relatively well-informed about lots of things, including the U.S. and South Korea and the alliance and our military plans and our diplomatic initiatives. But on the other hand, because of the nature of their system and their isolation, I think the way they assess these things probably involves a great deal of misunderstanding and misjudgment, misassessment of us. And that because they don't talk with each other, that also compounds their proclivity to make mistakes and do stupid, incomprehensible things, or at least to me, some of the things you mentioned are kind of hard to understand. There may be more that those of us on the outside don't know about that make it more reasonable. But there's a lot of mistakes that the North Koreans make.
The gentleman in the back.
Quoting from the scripture of your report, the United States should ask Congress to approve major increases for personnel budgets. Amen, amen. All aspects of North Korean policy. These include defense, intelligence, diplomacy, sanctions, implementation, human rights, and public relations, including getting more outside information on the North Korean people. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about the public relations and the getting more outside information. I was a public diplomacy officer at the embassy when David was there in the political section. So that's my question.
Thank you very much. As you say, I do mention this in the paper. I didn't focus on it for two reasons. One is I'm not a great expert in it. And two, I do not regard it as the central element in all of this, in part because the timeline we're dealing with now has been so truncated. But I believe it's still worth the effort. I mean, we're doing some of this already. Private groups, South Korea and other countries are doing some of it. My impression is we can do considerably more, but it's very hard even today to get a lot of information into North Korea. And I think we also have to be careful about some of the efforts. I don't want to see individual North Koreans get caught with this stuff and then, be terribly treated. There's a real moral and ethical element to this that I haven't thought through, but is there. As for PR, as some of you know, I'm sort of a contrarian, and I have been fairly supportive of the Obama administration's approach, at least understanding of it, when you look at the other theoretical options available to the U.S. government to deal with North Korea. On the other hand, I think that I wish the administration had done a better job of explaining its policy. The longest explanation I ever saw was at the beginning of the first term, wasn't it, Chris, like year 2 or 3, when Hillary Clinton gave a statement about that long about the rationale of our North Korea policy. My thing here is 10 times longer. And So for me, why should David Straub have to come and discuss why the freeze is not a practical thing? Clearly, the Obama administration, since February 2012, does not believe it's practical. So they should have been out there explaining this to leaders and to publics. And as far as I know, they really haven't. Maybe that would have made things worse in some way. Maybe it would have just caused more debate and controversy, and they felt it was more trouble than it was worth. I don't know. But my inclination is to feel that we would have been in a marginally better position, at least, if we had done a better job of explaining how the United States government regards the situation and why we have adopted the policies we have.
We have time for one last question from Larry.
Larry Nix from CSIS and ICUS and George Washington. David, I'd like to ask you about what I would describe as the sanction that has never become a sanction against North Korea, and that is an oil cutoff by UN member states. During your years in the State Department with the Bush administration, I saw a number of reports that the Bush administration had raised the issue of an oil cutoff with China. And I believe the Obama administration also has had discussions like this with China. Can you tell us, from your experience during those years, we know the Chinese rejected the idea, but did the Chinese present all of you with reasons for their rejection that, in your view, were credible expressions of their real attitudes in rejecting the idea of an oil cutoff? Well, what did the Chinese say to you in terms of their reasons, and how credible do you think they were in expressing their real attitudes about this? And secondly, could you tell us anything about the estimates that the State Department and the Bush administration was operating on in terms of what would be the effects of an international oil cutoff on North Korea?
Thank you very much, Larry. These are good questions, but I don't have good direct answers directly to the questions, but I may be able to say some related things that might be of interest. I do not recall ever being in a discussion during the George W. Bush administration where we discussed an oil cutoff, much less being in the room when U.S. and Chinese officials discussed that. I vaguely recall press reports to that effect. I can easily imagine that some U.S. officials did raise it with the Chinese, but I have no idea what the Chinese, specifically said in response to that. In general, in my very limited experience with the Chinese, when we're dealing with them and talking about North Korea, they were extremely vague. They listened to us, but their basic response was, we support denuclearization, but we must preserve peace on the peninsula, and we need to negotiate. And that was it. They said it with a million different words and all sorts of different configurations, but that was basically all that I ever heard them say. I'm sure there are some China experts, people who speak China, who have a lot of close Chinese friends who've heard a little more detail. But that's all I ever heard while I was in government. And it seems to me that everybody in the U.S. government at that time, as best I can reinvent this, was hoping that China would be willing to do something like that. There was that one report, can't remember the year, in which there was reportedly the Chinese had cut off the pipeline for, a few days. And I myself, it may have happened, because lots of people seem to believe it, including in the U.S. government, but I myself never saw intelligence or information that made me confident that it ever happened.
It was a couple of years ago. And I think what we did see was there was a 1 or 2 or 3 day period where the numbers were down.
Oh, not just that, but there was one years before that, during the George W. Bush.
Reports going back into your period.
Yeah. That I think it was like 3 days or something. But and again, it's really fascinating to see what people latch on. Now, this could just be that I did not have access to the intelligence, or that I saw some of it and misread it. But I'm pretty sure that people believe that because they wanted to believe it, that was another case of wishful thinking. So I think generally that everybody in government who's worked on this very long, from in those days and probably even today, believe that China is not, at least not yet, going to seriously consider cutting off the oil. That would be sort of the ultimate Chinese act, and as far as I know, they've never considered that or even begun to consider that. Sorry, I wish I were better informed and had a better memory, but that's my recollection.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. If you haven't picked up a copy of David's paper, please be sure to do so on your way out. It's also on our website. Please also join me in thanking David for spending time with us here today.